We have a great pleasure today to have Professor JAMIN PELKEY with us for this course of a semiotics of technology, and I also thank Matteo Treleani, Professor Matteo Treleani, for the hospitality within his stretch of the course. Professor Dr. JAMIN PELKEY is a professor and program director in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and a core member of the Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University, York graduate program in Communication and Culture. He has a very extensive CV. I'm going to just read the highlights. He joined the department in 2013, following 5 years of university lecturing in British Columbia and more than a decade of field experience in China, Thailand, and Australia. Holds a PhD in linguistics from La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, and his areas of specialization include philosophy of language, embodied cognition, Tibeto-Burman linguistics, historical linguistics, verse, and of course, semiotics. He is an award-winning teacher and also a winner of the Mouton d'Or Award for Best Article in Semiotica in 2017. Professor Pelkey's first two published monographs, including Dialectology as Dialectic, the Groyden 2011, identify 18 new languages through mixed methods, fieldwork, and analysis, that his latest research focuses on language evolution and embodied cognition, leading to the publication of his third authored book, The Semiotics of X, Bloomsbury Academic in 2017, which is going to be also, I guess, referred to in today's lecture, and it was, the cover of the book was also in the poster, the leaflet for today's lecture, today's talk. He has edited or co-edited 11 collections, published in numerous prestigious journals, and he is also vice president of the International Association for Cognitive Semiotics, executive member of the International Cognitive Linguistics Association and the Semiotic Society of America, and also past managing associate editor of the American Journal of Semiotics. Now is co-editor-in-chief of Semiotica. It's a role that I have the pleasure and the honor of sharing with him, which is the Journal of the International Association for Semiotic Studies. It is a great pleasure to have you here, JAMIN, for this talk. The floor is all yours, and we look forward to listening to you. Please, Professor. Thank you, Steve.
It is an honor and a pleasure to be here. Usually I meet with Massimo every Thursday and Stephanie in order to talk about the journal. So finally we can be in person. And I'm especially excited to be interacting with the research group in Facets because of the innovation and possibilities that the group brings to the forefront. So I'll try to address some of the themes of interest to the group in the context of this course. But my research in linguistics bubbled over into an interest in a particular linguistic feature that hadn't been getting much attention called chiasmus. I'm not going to talk a lot directly about chiasmus, but chiasmus is in the background. So let me just give a brief definition up front. It's basically A, B, C, X, CBA. So on the surface, it looks like it's symmetrical, but that's deceiving because what comes after the reversal is in some sense marked relative to what came before and then undermines it or calls it into question, brings all sorts of dynamics into play. I have a sense that ongoing research in chiasmus will become as important and revolutionary for the 21st century as metaphor research was for the 20th century. But I could be wrong. Let's Without further ado, let's get into the topic with a Valentine's tweet from a friend of mine in California. Happy Valentine's, and I know this is not Valentine's, but the throwback to earlier in the year, it is relevant. You are the interpretant of my love, says Perse. You are the signifier to my signified, says De Saussure. You are my semiosphere, says Yuri Loveman. Your face is like a square, says Gramas. Of course, this is why I'm bringing this up. Now, I haven't found any passage in A.J. Gramas's work that refers to your face as a square. But we all know that. I mean, please let me know if you found this, because I'd be very interested and grateful. But there's an interesting overlap here. Besides the semiotic square, which I'll bring this back around to momentarily, there's an immediate connection visually made by the artist, who I assumed was consulting with others, who created the A.J. Gramas Centenary coin in Lithuania. It's a 20-euro coin. You may have seen it. Let's see, is this? I guess I could. Oops. All right. So on the head's side of the coin is this great image of Gramas. Whenever I see this, I always think Gramas must have been a fascinating character to interact with. I mean, here he's like, "Hey, kid, you want to mess with me? Say that again." That's what it looks like, but I don't know. But of course, the interesting aspect is the fact that the artist mapped on the semiotic square to the face, with the S1 term listed as A in opposition to B, and then the negation of each in inverse correlatives, the bottom of the square mapped onto his face. It's interesting, and also interesting and highly relevant for this talk as well is the fact that a coat of arms is placed on the back. I'll come back to these themes momentarily. But first of all, I want to jump into an issue from Embodied Cognition from a Belgian philosopher writing in French. This is one of his sources translated into English, Henri van Leer, who argues that human beings are transverse primates. While other animals are radiolarian, like a circular organization, like a starfish, for example, or a caudal rostral with their backbone parallel to the earth and head and tail on either side. Homo is transverse, and thus frontal dorsal, stricto sensu, dorsal being like your backbone, conferring a front not only to ourselves, but to everything coming in front of us. This face that we give to the world is transferred across the whole surface of our body image, which is now orthogonal to the plane of the earth. And we also project that face onto everything around us, or so we did traditionally. As a result, Henri van Leer argues that we create an angularized space and divide the world up in that way. So in my research in this book, Semiotics of X, a much larger project where I'm trying to unpack the implications of Henri van Leer's thought and the thought of many other people to try to come up with a new understanding of the reorganization of the anatomical planes. It's what you see on the right here is a meme from the internet naturally, and it took off. It's been a while, like 2015, I think. But it captures your attention immediately because it sets you into a different mind space and then asks you to think about yourself a more anthropomorphized version, versus taking the perspective of the other animal, the allo animal. But it illustrates in a whimsical way what we have to reorient to when in thinking about the anatomical planes. I've already referenced the coronal plane, which separates front from back. The sagittal plane is the plane that separates left from right. The transverse plane, which organizes everything else, according to Henri von Leer, is the human waistline, and separating upper from lower in a very different kind of phenomenology than any other animal experiences. Because for other animals, upper is not where things are in control or happy or powerful, but where things are unknown and where frightening other creatures could jump on your back. So this is one way in which our metaphorical meaning, our understanding of the world is radically transformed. We come to think, for better and for worse, of our upper body as being good and powerful, our lower body, which is still connected to the earth, and the animal being bad or powerless. And then this transforms our belief system, and it also reshapes our consciousness in profound ways. So just a brief introduction. There's a lot more to say on any of this, but I need to move into the content a bit more. One more piece of background. I want to stress that this isn't just an abstracted, static model that we inherit. It's a model that we only come to realize through moving, living being. And this is something that Maxine Sheets Johnstone, a philosopher of dance, brings to the forefront of our understanding more than anyone else, developing the thought of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. She says it's erroneous to think that movement simply takes place in space, since on the contrary, we formally create space in the process of moving. Furthermore, since the body moves as an integrated whole, short of this fundamental kinetic integrity, we could hardly discover regularities. Thus, in both a phylogenetic and an ontogenetic sense, the phylogenetic through deep time and history, the ontogenetic through the development of the individual and the species and in population groups. Thinking is fundamentally modeled on the body. So what I'm trying to develop ultimately is a kinesthetic pattern grammar. We have to move beyond kinesthesis, as I'm going to talk about as well. But this pattern grammar, it asks basically, what are the bodily interactive evolutionary sources of creative reflexive modeling, which I understand as what we mean by language in its root sense. And is it possible that an emergent pattern grammar of embodied movement played a crucial role? I assume that it must be to some degree, but the way that we pay attention to these oppositional contrasts that we live through conceptually has shifted through time, especially in the past 200 years, with a very different understanding of what symmetry is, even, because in Leonardo da Vinci's time, symmetry was symmetria, and it was understood as proportional harmony between parts and wholes, in which the upper body and the lower body were the main oppositional source of contrast. And now we've come to think of ourselves as split down the middle, with left-right oppositions being the most salient, the most prominent, and that gives us a lot of really powerful analytic thinking tools to understand the world, but it also has severe consequences for our own personal well-being and for cultural institutions as a whole. I'm interested in the X pattern from all of these perspectives, because I think the X pattern it's both a highly salient figure in contemporary advertising and popular culture, and also a figure that links back to our evolutionary development in deep time. I think one of the ways that this happens is not just through moving and understanding our new face and projecting these features onto the world, but also as, and maybe originally as a threat posture, which many other animals display as well. Bears, horses, skunks, raccoons, and the cutest of all, red pandas, I think. In this case, actually mirroring each other. And it can happen in play, which I suspect is happening with the red pandas. But what happens when any mammal does this, stands up on the back, you double and maybe even triple in size. If a species was able to develop this ability to walk across the savanna, for example, or through the forest this way, predators would clear out for miles around. And especially if a whole group was doing it, not just a single individual. So it's plausible as one part of the story. I'm not arguing that it's the new silver bullet that explains everything. But it also helps us understand where a kind of firsthand consciousness of polysemy could have come from. Polysemy in its extreme forms, like one bodily posture that could result in both a sense of agony and terror or extreme fright, because let's say you're frightened by a predator and you instinctively take on this posture. You're terrified, but then you take on the predator runs away. You're suddenly elated. If you start to pay attention to what's happened, it could become a very basic form of understanding radical polysemy. And so with that in mind, it would be no wonder we find this in rock art, independent from independent civilizations around the world, and we find it codified in contemporary rituals of sport and torture, and I think that's been the case through deep time. I need to keep track of time. Speaking of time, it's 8:50. What should I plan on?
Started at 8:30, so we can.
Okay.
30 to 10, and then break. Yes.
Okay. All right. That's good. Very good. Since I think I have a little bit more time than I was afraid I did, let me just mention this particular piece of rock art, which is in Baja, California, this great peninsula. It's in a cave called the Serpent Cave, because you have these two antler-headed serpents that are facing off. And researchers interested in this cave noticed that the cave lights up, the sun shines in this cave at a certain time of the year. Solstice. I don't remember if it's winter solstice or spring solstice, but it's the time of the year that the seasons are shifting. So you have two extreme forms meeting each other, and all of the humanoid creatures around the snake, to some degree or another, are taking this posture as a group, the spread eagle posture. So it's a posture of extremes from many different viewpoints, and that's been recognized in this way, fairly explicit way, through deep time in traditional cultures. Without digging further into kinesthetic pattern grammar, let me just mention the case studies that I want to focus on here as applications of Gramas's square as a face that gives a face to everything else we confront. I want to talk about the square directly and its roots in Aristotle's two universal propositions, and then four logical propositions that are at the basis of the rest of logical thinking. I want to talk about gestural space. I want to talk about the grammar of visual design from Kress and von Leeuwen. And I also want to talk about heraldry. And I'll wrap up with an application from a non-Western context, because we always have to think, what if all of these presuppositions and understandings are just a result of our own cultural heritage? And of course, it makes sense to us, but does it also make sense to another culture? So we'll have a bit of an extended reflection on the organization of these Tanka paintings from Tibet, called the Yama Baba Chakra, or the Tibetan Wheel of Life. All right, first, some reflections on the semiotic square. The semiotic square starts off in Aristotle's treatise on universal propositions and their oppositional relations. It was diagrammed pretty early on, at least in some commentators on Aristotle, and then the diagrams became systematized in medieval times. Translated into analytic logic, the relationships look like this at the bottom, and translated into ordinary natural language, all SRP. So you could say all swans are white and no swans are white. And in analytic logic, these propositions have gotten a lot of press time, especially once it was discovered in Australia that actually some swans are not white. So some swans are white, some swans are not white. So what happens with the subcontrary relations is a kind of undermining of what we took for granted. So it's relevant for scientific inquiry, but it's also relevant for understanding how logical propositions relate to each other. Analytic logicians in that Anglo-American tradition who take this really seriously lost interest in Aristotle's logical square of oppositions because they simply seemed obvious, I suppose. So we're fortunate that A.J. Gramas picked up on them again from the perspective of semantic relationships, because he drew to our attention the way that we organize cultural relations. And being able to pay attention to these relations makes the difference between being able to critique them or even understand how that we're being controlled by them. So Gramas just recommends his semiotic square of oppositions as a heuristic, but he also argues that it is the fundamental organizing principle of culture and cognition. He himself is not interested in trying to understand how that happens or why. He proposes it as a methodology, but he does have this strong theoretical claim. I'm very interested as a cognitive semiotician in how it's rooted in our own embodied experience. And I assume that it's embodied for some of the reasons that I've already mentioned, and not just abstracted as if it were somehow inherited as a Platonic form in our neural architecture. But you're familiar with the semiotic square, and I've just mentioned the way that it's inherited from Gramas. So, for example, the subject as I being in opposition to the object, which you could refer to as it, and then the object being contradicted by the non-object, which you could identify as the self underneath, and the subject being contradicted by the non-subject or the other. Self-other relations then, in some sense, interpreting, in some sense potentially undermining the simplicity of the basic oppositional relation between I and it. Again, with life versus death, and the way that they're called into question and undermined by the undead or zombies, or by realization that some species are extinct or simply non-living, and as a result we can't simply call them dead. But what's being brought into our awareness by paying attention to these relationships are the ways that these are mutually defining pairs. They cannot exist on their own. And that's the important thing to remember. Nonetheless, they're not simply identical and interchangeable, because if you shift one, the rest of the diagram also has to shift around. Now, My argument is that this is an embodied diagram. And I want to suggest that the unmarked term, which Gramas argues is extremely important for getting the rest of the diagram right or understanding the relationships at all, goes in the upper left corner. That's something that Jameson really draws attention to in one of his classical, I would say magisterial prefaces to Gramas's collection of essays on meaning, that the S1 term must be placed in the upper left. But what I'm arguing is that this is not the upper left. This is the upper right. And the semiotic square of opposition, like the logical square of relations, is an embodied diagram. And it maps onto our embodied movement because we face it as interlocutors face to face, so that we understand that my right is on your left and my left is on your right, facing this diagram. I'll come back to that argument in a bit. First, let's look at some other correlates in the grammar of visual design from Kress and von Leeuwen. This has gone through 3 editions. It's safe to say it's a classic in the literature, and one of their most fundamental diagrams in the grammar of visual design is this diagram: the given in opposition with the new and their relationship with the real. Now, of course, as you know, Kress and von Leeuwen are very much influenced by the work of Roland Barthes. And Roland Barthes himself is very influenced by Jacques Lacan's work. And so thinking of the real in a Lacanian sense is important. And I don't have time to go into that. I'm still working through the implications and understanding of it myself. But for Lacan, the real is something that's juxtaposed with with linguistic aspects of culture, and then your own sense of alienation from yourself and from the real because of linguistic aspects of culture. This 3-part division in intention is part of what's underlying this diagram. But I want to focus on the way that it maps onto the same kinds of relationships with the semiotic square. This upper left, or what I would say from an embodied perspective as an interlocutor being the upper right, is the ideal, the cultural representation, that which is most prominent, that organizes everything else. It's the given, it's what's assumed, it's the S1 term, the default. And then the new information that comes into contrast with it, and the way that these are undermined but also grounded in the real. Now, the center is what's bringing all of them into relationship from a visual design perspective. So these kinds of principles map onto the way we interpret book covers, magazine layouts, web page layouts, and murals, works of art. Let's continue to give examples and move to discussion of heraldry now. I just added this one. Hopefully this is actually not the internet playing a trick on me. This is the actual coat of arms for Turin. But for heraldry, we get a further clue that geometric arrangements, especially from traditional cultures, are organized as interlocutors and not so much as abstracted impersonal diagrams. We know this because in heraldry, what we would say is the left-hand side is known as the dextral side, and what we would say is the right-hand side is the sinistral. Now that's a great paradox because we all know that dextral is a reference to right hand, and sinistral is the reference to the left. The two of them being in one of the most basic modes of oppositional relationship, as mutually defining pairs. In gesture space studies, this comes into the forefront as well, but from a more directly personal space. When you're face to face with another person and both of you are gesturing, their upper right is understood to be on your upper left, and vice versa. Their upper left is understood to be on your upper right. This diagram from McNeil, which codifies gesture space in the literature, is the classic representation of this experience that we all know intuitively, and we constantly adjust to. How do I know? What evidence do I have for saying we know this intuitively and constantly adjust to? You could just take my word for it or go based on your experience, but there's actually been a lot of empirical research done on human psychology and cognition from infancy. Researchers have a difficult time getting mothers to give up their infants in the minutes right after birth, but we do know that within 20 days or so, infants already have a good understanding of what Broughton refers to as alteroception. In Broughton's words, the typical child has the innate capacity to experience, usually out of awareness, what another is doing or experiencing, as if the child's center of orientation and perspective were centered in the other. So this moves us beyond proprioception into alteroception. So in proprioception, we're inhabiting the movements of our own body, and we have a sense for where everything is in space. In alteroception, we're inhabiting the feeling of the other's body, especially the person that we're face to face with, and experiencing what it's like to be them. So you know these. You've probably seen the classic experiments or diagrams of them in intro psych courses, where you look at an infant and stick out your tongue, or even put a pencil in the place where your mouth is, and the infant will stick out their tongue back at you, or make a rounded face, and they will as well. And this develops, and it becomes more and more complex through early childhood development. So such that by 20 days or so, and possibly from birth, the jury is still out on that, if an adult facing an infant rotating their head clockwise, the infant will also rotate their head clockwise, which you wouldn't expect. If we're just talking about mirror relations, then the infant mirroring the adult would be going counterclockwise. But there's an inverse relationship going on because of, and arguably it's because of alteroception. The infant knowing instinctively to enter into the feeling space of the other. So in other studies in early childhood development, an adult saying, "Do as I do," and then raising their hands like this. Normally developing children will mirror that, and that is more like a mirror relation. But children who have developmental disorders, such as different levels of autism, would be just as likely to do this, because there's just an abstracted relation. So these are all examples of alteroception. We may speak with Hobson of non-inferential empathy, the direct perception of and effective responsiveness to bodily affective expressions of others, as a principal mode of intersubjective communion in felt immediacy. And he refers to how Merleau-Ponty quotes Husserl's dictum that the perception of others is like a phenomenon of coupling, emphasizing the simple fact that I live in the facial expressions of the other, as I feel him living or living in mine. I wanted to read this quote and list it on the screen because I think this is especially true in facial feeling, and feeling what it's like to be the other person based on their really minute facial expressions. Images of some other experiments that show ways in which this is inverted. I want to continue with thinking about face-to-face communication from Merleau-Ponty, because a lot of the contemporary research is developing his ideas. In order to imitate the action of someone facing me and performing something with his left hand, it's not necessary for me to be aware of the fact consciously. Like, you don't have to say, okay, all right, wait a minute now, that's their left hand, so I'm going to be tricked by this. It's on my right, but we don't have to think through it consciously. The hand which appears on the right side of my visual field is for my partner, the left one. Such an account may be required for subjects with imitation impairments, for example, in autism, while for typical subjects of normal imitation, the subject's left hand is immediately identified with that of the partner's with his action, inviting immediate modeling in an inverse or chiastic X-like way. The capacity for the transformation of left-right coordinates is preeminently embodied in this existential process. In this face-to-face situation, by virtue of the body image as a system of equivalence, not just as a system of present bodily positions, but an open system of variety of equivalent positions and moves directed to other ends. All right. So, in thinking about space, not just as kinesthetic and proprioceptive, but as projective and alteroceptive, I think we're justified in, we at least have a plausible account of why the semiotic square could be an interlocutor. It also makes more sense because in cultures around the world, the default orientation or side tends to be the right side, just as we find in Latin, dexter versus sinistro. One is tended to be the unmarked and the other marked, and that's what organizes all of these spaces that I've already mentioned. So that mapping the S1 term onto the upper left would be more like an autistic interpretation of what we're seeing, instead of thinking about this as a more personal interlocutor whose dynamics we're mirroring in an inverse way. But what if, and I still have about 20 minutes, so that's good. What if all of this is just a Western perspective? It's a question we always have to bring to the forefront. I've been casting around for models, looking at models that could, and this is a way in which the research is being developed beyond the first book. I'm in order to test this hypothesis. And I think what we have in the Tibetan Wheel of Life, these Thangka paintings from Tibet, provides a kind of empirical test of the hypothesis. First, I need to provide some background on this Wheel of Life, because otherwise it just looks scary, like scary chaos. The Bhava Chakra from Tibet is also known as the Wheel of Suffering, the Wheel of Existence, the Wheel of Rebirth, the Wheel of Samsara. Now, if it's just a wheel, like the Wheel of Fortune, you may know the US TV game show, Wheel of Fortune, and they spin the wheel, it would just be random. Like you could, and so the organization of this wheel would just be random. People copying it or copying certain elements might shift through time, and if it's copied enough, you might expect, if you have a large enough data set, that the images could be placed anywhere. But you do notice there's these distinct divisions. So what are these divisions about? Well, I'm glad you asked. So there's a logic, there's an organization, but the big question I'm interested in is whether or not the organization applies to these different categories. In the center, there's a pig, a rooster, and a snake that are chasing each other around, and they represent greed, delusion, and hatred. And I mean, so this is a hortatory aid. It's kind of like a stained glass window. It's intended to teach a sermon or to embody doctrine for Lama Buddhism. In Tibet and far beyond in Tibet proper, all the way into Mongolia, and then of course into Nepal and northeast India, northwest Yunnan, Sichuan province. So the greater Tibetan region of Lama Buddhism. Then the next ring in this set is the ring of karma, good versus bad, and that is going to play a major role in the discussion. Even though I'm not going to focus on the three poisons, I'm most salient for my discussion is karma and the realms of samsara. So, and as for the realms of samsara, let's see, oh yeah, there we go. Hide that guy. There we go. The realms of samsara, we have hell, heaven, titans, humans, animals, and ghouls. Those are just my translations, anyways. But so there's some basic analogies you can make. Hell, the Buddhist hell doesn't map onto Christian hell, but there's definitely some analogies. It's not the place you want to go. It's not your first choice for being reborn in the afterlife. And heaven isn't the ultimate. It's still on the wheel of samsara. What you really want to do is get enlightenment. And then you're sort of beyond heaven and hell and gods and demons. You're in the realm of pure nirvana. But it's definitely better than hell. And I'm pointing. You can tell that there's already a sort of generalization that heaven and hell are in opposition across the horizontal plane. But then there's these titans and humans, animals, and ghouls. You could be reincarnated as an animal. You could be reincarnated as a ghoul, which is a hungry ghost. And that's pretty bad. It's not as bad as hell. But you also don't want to be reincarnated as a hungry ghost because you have an enormous appetite, but you have a tiny little sphincter of a mouth. And so you're faced with all this food, but you can only eat like one crumb at a time. And meanwhile, your appetite is just growing and growing. And so you're tortured that way until you die and get another chance on the wheel of samsara. So that's the hungry ghosts or ghouls. And then humans, we're pretty familiar with that. And then animals or allo animals, the other animals you could be reincarnated as. Titans, we're not very familiar with. Titans are like warring gods. They're constantly, so they're higher status than humans, and so in one way they're better than humans. They have and they're living in palaces and they have all sorts of means, but they are also constantly fighting, and they're at war with heaven, as it turns out. So heaven's better than them and has more power, but they're constantly fighting in conflict with heaven. So we have some basic relationships, and they're in interrelation with each other. So since the wheel itself is a geometric space, it's worth asking whether or not this maps onto the semiotic square as a kind of test of this hypothesis. So once again, the organization. And what I'm doing, this is an ongoing research project, is collecting these Thangka paintings from sources including images taken by tourists from walls of monasteries, to photo books, and then Thangka paintings that are sold to tourists, and then interpretations of Thangka paintings in derivative cultures. So the whole gamut coded to try to see if there's some kinds of significant correlations. And this is an ongoing project, but what I've discovered in the process is there's actually two models: the 6-spoke model, which is more common, the 5-spoke model, which seems to have been the original. And there's definitely two principal axes of contrast. The axes of contrast are validated by this center ring that it's the second out from the center, and then the third ring in particular. Let's see. But none of this would make sense. Let me just go back to my overarching hypothesis without the face. Facing you, the first thing you notice when you look at this image, it would be hard not to notice, would be this creature. intended to be very fierce, because this is the Yama, the monster Yama, the god of impermanence, chaos, and death. And that's what the sermon of this visual sermon is trying to constantly bring back to people's attention, that we're all going to die, and it's just a matter of time, and it's coming up faster than you think, and where you're going to end on this wheel. Right? So and it's pretty effective. I mean, like, hard. But there's lots of different versions of this monster, but the monster tends to have his hands on or directly above. In some cases, is actually taking a spread eagle posture. But it forces you to think of the wheel, even if you're thinking of it abstracted. With this monster here, it becomes impossible not to think of this wheel as an embodied interlocutor, because it's oriented to the body of the Yama monster, which is an anthropomorph, even though he has claws, and you hope you never meet a human like that, but he's definitely an anthropomorph. So Yama is basically reminding us that my right is on your left is on my right, or your right is on my left is on your right, in non-analytic ways. But that's the chiastic structure of this diagram. Drawing on work in Teaser, 2006, which is the most well-developed historical visual account of this. It's sort of there's a blend of anthropology, religious theory, and historical archaeological work compiled in this novel, published by University of Washington Press in 2006. He identifies the original model as a 5-spoke model, but there are also some very early versions, including 3-dimensional versions, in ancient caves in China that developed the 6th version model, or show how it began to develop. And what the 6th version model does is it introduces heaven as a contrast to hell. And whereas before you just had the warring gods, which were sort of a correlate, so they're sort of in heaven and not in heaven, and then the humans that are sort of in between the gods and the demons, or the gods and the animals, depending. So far I have 103 exemplars, and if you notice more of these, please send them my way, because I'm trying to get as large of a data set as I can. I've had this on hold for quite a while because of a number of other projects. And then coding based on multiple layers of contrast, or levels of contrast. Most of the models that I've found are the 6-spoke models, which at least means it's the one that's most likely to be replicated, which plausibly means that it's the one that makes the most sense of things from an embodied perspective. So in all cases with the 6-spoke model, heaven is always in this central category, central upper category. Hell is always in the lower category. So you're thinking of this from Yama's perspective, a human interlocutor perspective. This is the separation of the waistline, which involves all sorts of conceptual metaphors that only make sense with relation to upright posture. The second central ring, 89% depict karma in a strict left-right relationship. And a lot of them include some levels of gradients as well, but this is one of the clearest representations of both gradients and strict left-right divide. But notice that this is just abstracted. What you have here is on your left, so which doesn't make sense for most people around the world who are right-handed and think of the right-hand side as good and the left-hand side as bad or suspicious. So it only makes sense if this is an embodied diagram with Stan Bratton's alteroception in mind. Let's see, let's. Sorry, I included some extra slides in here accidentally. Things have to get messed up at some point. All right. So when it comes to the warring gods and humans, they're always on the upper as well, but they shift. They can shift, and I haven't found one being more prominent than the other. So it just determines on which perspective you're taking. This is also true of Gramas's square. And what in one context you may assume to be the unmarked term, in another context could be the marked term. There can be shifting reversals between them. But what's good to notice here is that animals and the hungry ghosts are always on the bottom half. Now, animals, I mean allo animals, other animals. So that in that sense, they kind of undermine the relationships of the other or ground them. They're more fundamental, you could say, or closer to hell, if you want to take that perspective from a Buddhist perspective. But there are multiple layers of logical organization, and that are at least analogous to the semiotic square and would not make sense without the relationships of upright posture. So this becomes at least a partial confirmatory test of the embodied proposition that I'm suggesting. Now I want to move this into some applications in the 6 minutes that I have left, and applications and implications that I think are best from what I found in my reading so far anyways, and I would really like to get your advice on this for thinking about our contemporary plight, whether in terms of technology, in terms of experience, in terms of culture. What are the consequences of thinking of something like the semiotic square as just an abstracted diagram, or the organization of space as just abstracted so that what's at the upper right from an embodied perspective is at the upper left. It seems to be trivial or inconsequential until we recognize that what happens at that level of abstraction is a kind of depersonalization. And it's this depersonalization that I think has profound consequences, and that semiotics needs to pay more attention to, not simply to be relevant to concerns of the contemporary world, but because semiotics is best situated, and embodied semiotics in particular, to call attention to what we're losing by relinquishing our humanity, by forgetting that the face that becomes spread across the whole surface of the front of our body that we project onto other things is inherently personalizing. Ian McGilchrist is a neuroscientist, literary historian, and a psychotherapist in England. You may have come across this book. This is the second edition in 2019 with Yale University Press. If you can't see the subtitle, it's The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. He's not a brain in the vat kind of scientist and thinker. His understanding is that the hemisphere separation is specialized in such a way that the right hemisphere for humans is deeply enmeshed in the world and in proprioception, kinesthesia, in alteroception, while the left hemisphere specializes in serial processing. In the process, he debunks a lot of the assumptions we have with left brain versus right brain thinking. That left brain is simply science and math and language, and right brain is artsy fartsy, feel good. He debunks that right from the very beginning, but he says there's something that false history causes us to neglect and miss that's profoundly important. And one of the things he draws attention to are these different ways of knowing that are encoded in many languages. Interestingly, not in English. English know has to take on the burden of both of these senses. But many other European languages make a clear distinction between, and East Asian languages as well. In Chinese, there's a big difference between 知道 and 认识. If you 认识 something, then you know it as a person. You don't just know facts about it or have isolated, fragmented memories of it. You know it because of narrative-based personal interaction through time, through shared experience in deep feeling, and projection, in inhabiting the other person's body with your imagination. So these distinctions, the distinction that he picks up on in German between Wissen and Kennenlernen is at the heart of this passage that I want to read in closing. To take one example of an apparently non-living entity that appears to require us to know it in the sense of kennen rather than wissen, think of a piece of music. The approach to music is like entering into relation with another living individual. And research suggests that understanding music is perceived as similar to knowing a person. We freely attribute human qualities to music, including age, sex, personability, characteristics, and feelings. The empathic nature of the experience means that it has more in common with encountering a person than a concept or an idea that could be expressed in words. It is important to recognize that music does not symbolize emotional meaning, which would require it to be interpreted. It metaphorizes it. It carries it over, direct to our unconscious minds. Equally, it does not symbolize human qualities. It conveys them direct, so that it acts on us and we respond to it as in a human encounter. In other words, knowing a piece of music, like knowing other works of art, is a matter of Kennenlernen. Coming to us through the right hemisphere, such living creations are seen as being essentially human in nature. In an earlier book, I argued that works of art, music, poems, paintings, great buildings can be understood only if we appreciate that they're more like people than texts, concepts, or things. But the perception is ancient. Aristotle, for example, compared tragedy to an organic being. And that's what I'm proposing for the semiotic square, that it be thought of as an organic being, and that most things in the world, from a truly whole human perspective, aren't simply anthropomorphized in a pejorative sense, but personalized in a profoundly meaningful sense. And to the degree that we lose that ability, we not only lose the ability to see the meaning in things, in human creations, but we lose the ability to understand meaning altogether. Thank you.